stuff. We have got a heck of a lineup tonight. So these are the editors. It sounds like the newest rock band in town. So Emily Trahead, current editor there on the right. We've got Helen Nicholson next to her, John Barney and Ned Thomas. And I'm going to be talking to them in just a couple of minutes. After them, we will have a break. There'll be 2 breaks in, so don't worry about getting your drinks and your toilet breaks in. Toilets, gents there, women's there, and the bar will be open throughout, so help yourselves. Yeah, tonight is a celebration, of course. So I was going to tell you what was on. After the editors, we've got Owen Shears, not the author, the musician, confusing. Does the Cynefin project, is known as. So he'll be playing after the editors, after the first break. Another little break, then we've got 2 poets, Eric Nagarth-Charles and Mike Jenkins. And then a wee break while Cattell Koenig sets up for the final part of the evening. So it's going to be a variety, it's going to be a roller coaster of entertainment and some really, really wonderful stuff, all to celebrate Planet Magazine. I'm Mike Parker, by the way. I've been involved in Planet as a writer for, I was saying earlier on this afternoon, it's about half my life and half Planet's life. I'm just a little bit older than Planet. I know it doesn't show. But I actually came to Planet because I first started subscribing, mid-90s really. It was because Jan Morris told me to, and whatever Jan Morris ever told me to do, I generally did, because I was so in awe of her. And of course she was one of the patrons of Planet Magazine, and we lost her 2 years ago. We also lost another of the patrons, Emily Humphreys, in the same autumn 2 years ago. So 2 of the great elder statespeople of Welsh culture both lost at that time. And I was hosting, I was emceeing actually Planet's 40th birthday celebrations. And Jan was at that, and did a reading and stuff. And we lost also someone who else read that night, Nigel Jenkins. So, it's bittersweet. This is what happens, I suppose, but it's a bittersweet thing, thinking of those we have lost. But we're going to hear a little bit more of the history of it all shortly. So it is a celebration, as I say, but it is also the launch of Planet's crowdfunder. And this is pretty important. You've got flyers on your seats explaining the what, the why, and the wherefore of the Planet's crowdfunder. Obviously, it's a difficult time for every organisation. And you'll read there a little bit more of the background to it. So there are plenty of ways you can support Planet tonight. And during the breaks, you'll have a chance to go and see Lowry over there in the Victorian Draper's shop, as we decided it looks like. She will sell you a yard of linen or a subscription to Planet if you don't already have one. Also, copies available there of the new edition, the brand new edition, thanks to co-production between Planet as publisher and Parthian Books, of Charlotte Williams's Sugar and Slate memoir, which was published first by Planet 20 years ago, won the Wales Book of the Year, and has been republished just now. So there's copies of that available on Lowry's stall as well. You can make donations there. You can subscribe. And then at the back, so we've got a selection of a little table there with sort of display boards on it. That's a bit of a kind of potted history of some of the things about Planet worth knowing about. Some really fun stuff on there as well, including artwork by Stinos Anwyl, who's been sort of mashing up the covers of Planet and the artwork over the years and turning it into some fabulous collages. And there's also a book there that we would very much like you, if you possibly can, just to jot down anything that comes to mind about what Planet has meant to you over the years. And I know for myself, it's definitely something, when Jan told me to start subscribing, because she said, that is your best way into getting to know what Wales is all about. The full breadth of the stuff that's in it, that's what she knew that I needed to know about, and she was so right, and it is a fast track into Welsh life and culture, and the world from a Welsh perspective. That's what we were talking about this afternoon, and I think that's the thing. It is a different perspective, and for those of us that haven't grown up in Wales, it was a radical revision, really, of some of the stuff that we're told, just to see the world from a different point of view. So please do put stuff in the book there, and also Howell will be buzzing around in the intervals, just filming people. If you've got a sentence, you can just say something about Planet. That would be delightful on camera with Howell. Where is he? Where are you? Is he back at the back somewhere?
Oh,
there, yes, sorry. So yes, that would be great. It's not just good for, it's good for the history of, you know, to mark these things, and we lose them otherwise, but also, of course, for sort of funding and the rest of it. Now, the editors. I've already given you a quick run through of who they are. So they're sitting very handily in order of editorship as well. It's partly dictated by order of deafness. Between Ned, John and I, it's quite a contest on the left-hand side here. Yes. We want to arrange our ears in the right order. But it actually has turned out rather nicely in terms of the order. So Ned Thomas, ladies and gentlemen, the founder of Planet, way back, it's the 50th anniversary, but it's actually 52, is it not? 52 years this year.
Yes, it's 52 years, but Planet's 50th has been moved forward because of the pandemic.
Yes.
So 52 years ago, in August actually, at the Llandeilo Tavern was the launch of Planet.
And tell us what was the impetus for it? Why did you want to launch Planet?
Well, I can come to that from three directions. There's the personal impetus, there's the political context of the time, and there's the Welsh Arts Council context, which is less known about. But anyhow, my own trajectory was that I was 33 years old. I'd been an academic abroad in Salamanca in Spain and in the Soviet Union for a year. I'd been a journalist in London for the rest of the time, and I did something that was not all that uncommon in those days. I dropped out to try to live as a freelance and write a novel, believe it or not, which is still not seen the light of day. And I got a bursary from the Welsh Arts Council. But I arrived in Wales to do these things and to bring up my children in the Welsh-speaking area, which was also a motivation, I think. I arrived in the spring of 1969, which was a very turbulent year. Apart from the investiture, there were bomb explosions which were not at the time known to be those of John Jenkins on water pipelines and public buildings. The Cymdeithas early campaign was painting out road signs throughout Wales. The Free Wales Army was making itself evident. The police presence was really very unlike anything I'd experienced in England, although I'd experienced it in Spain and in Russia. When Covian had its march to Kilmary, there were police helicopters flying above it. There was even a police raid on the Welsh Arts Council's offices, which is hard to imagine today, really. And all this was going on, and it was getting no attention outside Wales for I to see. And so instead of writing the novel, which we have been saved from, I think, I knew I could sort of write polemical. I'd written a book about George Orwell, who was my kind of model in terms of style as well. And in the year and a half after dropping out into mid-Cardiganshire, I read The Welsh Extremist, and I put together a proposal for Planet. Welsh Extremist was intended for England, although over the years it was more read in Wales. And Planet was meant to bridge the gap in Wales. What I particularly felt was unforgivable was the English language press, I'm thinking of the Western Mail in particular in those days, it wouldn't publish letters, for instance, from WM putting the case for Welsh language road signs, because he was tarred with the same brushes of extremism, and that's why my book about extremists was a ironic title in a way. We're not that extreme, we're just asking for reasonable things. So Planet was to try to bridge that gap between Welsh-speaking Wales and English-speaking Wales, but I came to the job knowing very little about what had been happening in the last decades in Wales, because I've been abroad and so on, and people have pointed out, you know, I knew even less about English-speaking Wales, but I was young enough to not to worry about that. So that was my personal trajectory, and it would only have happened because I came at that particular conjuncture in the history of Wales, which without that I had no intention of publishing a magazine. In fact, I'd just given up editing a magazine which had a terribly large budget, would have kept Planet, even after inflation, for 50 years, would have kept Planet going for I don't know how long, because it was the British government's Russian language quarterly, which was to show the best of Britain in Russian, and so I could commission, you know, a short story by Graham Greene or something by Iris Murdoch, and money was no question. And then suddenly I was getting £2,000 or something, which I had to do everything.
So, and how did it go down? How was it received? Because it seems to me that the magazine arrived pretty fully formed. I mean, the magazine that you first published.
Yeah. Well, I had the skills to produce a magazine, because I'd been doing that, and I had sort of writing skills, but it wouldn't have come about except for another conjuncture of favourable stars, and that was the Welsh Arts Council was about a year or two old, and it had transformed itself from the Welsh Committee of the Arts Council of Great Britain, and it had made some appointments which included the late Mike Stevens as a literature officer. He was very keen on magazines, having founded Poetry Wales, which he had to give up when he became an employee of the Arts Council. The chairman of the Welsh Arts Council was Gwyn Jones, Professor Gwyn Jones, who was a novelist of the 30s and 40s from South Wales, from that mining tradition, and he had published and edited the Welsh Review between about 1939 and 48. So he had to pack up because there were, and the only English language magazine that was left, Wales had closed down, the Welsh Review had closed down, Anglo-Welsh Review was going and was a very solid magazine, reviewing more or less every book about Wales, but there was a gap, and it was a happy conjuncture that the Welsh Arts Council were looking for projects. I think they were particularly looking to develop projects on the English side, because Welsh magazines were getting some grant aid, but there was no tradition of giving grants to it. So I think there may have been a small degree of collusion with Mike Stevens, and that I had said, what do you think your committee would say to her? And he had said, well, I don't know what the committee would say, but I will speak for it, you see. So he did, and that's how it came about. And so, yes, I accept your kind words that it was professionally produced from the start, because I'd done that.
Well, I think I'm fully formed. I meant it in terms of its look and its professionalism, but also its kind of ethos. Seems to be. This is one of the remarkable things about Planet, that from the word go, it seems to have planted its flag and not stayed there, because it's developed its more.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
and that's not all of you too.
I think the trouble there is that with that narrative, that there is such a thing as what Hannah McMillan called events devoid, and the first number of Planet is a bit iconic because of the picture of George Thomas and the article leading article I wrote about him, which got the magazine typed in Wales. But in fact, I would never have written that. The magazine was more or less ready in the summer of 1970 when a general election to the London Parliament was called unexpectedly. And even more unexpectedly, Harold Wilson's government was swept from power. And Planet had to do something about. I quickly commissioned sort of something from Scotland about, the results there, and I thought, well, I must write something retrospective about the George Thomas era, and then, of course, everything that I also said on the Welsh extremists, all my sort of built-up feeling about this low point in Welsh Labour Party history came bubbling up. I mean, my position politically was more or less British New Left when I moved, but the moment Planet came out, of course, it was attacked by George Thomas, who was by then no longer in the Welsh office, because he'd lost that job with the change. So we were immediately put into the kind of nationalist camp because we were for language rights.
Everything went into the nationalist camp with George Thomas, didn't it?
Yes, exactly.
You name it. So just before we go on to this, just one quick question, Ned. On so from 1970 through to 1979, you published, and then had a hiatus. You called a stop to it in 1979. Yes. What happened there?
Well, I decided before the referendum of 1979, I decided to stop Planet, but it didn't. I had to go out for the year to come, so it didn't stop till the end of 1979, even the beginning of 1980. And the reason I decided to stop was I thought if the referendum goes in favour, we'll need something more than 6 times a year magazine. We need something which will follow the new politics of Wales more closely. If it fails, well, there's sort of reformist agenda. You must remember that I was very involved with the Welsh Fourth Channel campaign, and we were going into more and more protesting territory, more and more serious, because every committee had found in favour of the solution, but it refused. And then, of course, the referendum was negative. The new Thatcher government turned around on their promise for a Welsh language channel with Meredith Evans and people. I was in front of the courts for turning off the Pencarrig transmitter. So this all, that's the most contestatory period of Planet. It's because I'm finished thinking, well, this is not, I was right to close it down. We need something Popular Front. And in the wake of Planet, I joined with, some people would say, of all people, Di Smith, who had never appeared in Planet because he considered us to be on the pale. But I joined with him and John Osmond and Robin Reeves, who had been the FT's correspondent in Wales, was an experienced journalist, and we launched Arcade, which came out fortnightly and had a lot of rugby and aimed to meet, to reach thousands. And it certainly reached more people in its first few numbers, but in the end, it ended up the same people writing, a broader spread of opinion, certainly. So that, and then it was closed down by the Arts Council. Rebecca, which did a good job, rather occasionally appearing, of a radical kind, that closed down for other reasons. So in the wake of the miners' strike, 84, 85, I think that's right, various people said, you must restart Planet, including the Welsh Arts Council. So that was a strong position, and that was when I said, well, you know, I'm doing other things, and so I'm doing lots of things now, but we need an assistant editor, and this is where John came in. I handed it over to him finally in 1990, I think. So that's the story of the launch and relaunch.
So that's this interim period. So John, we turn to you. Thank you very much. That's a fascinating story. So you're obviously already aware of Planet and obviously appreciative of it. Was it an easy choice to get involved?
Yeah, it was. Throughout the 70s, I was living in and working in Denmark, and because I'd learned Danish, and Denmark has a very vibrant language culture, I started wondering what it would be like for me as a monoglot English speaker if I tried to engage with Welsh language culture. And we came back every year to Abergavenny, my hometown, and we'd always go to Cardiff to the Arts Council bookshop, the excellent Arts Council bookshop in Charles Street. And it was there I discovered Planet in about 1972-73, bought it and subscribed immediately. And I think for many people of my generation, it was a sort of crucial turning point, that it introduced me. It was a bridge between the English language culture I came from and Welsh language culture. And then I read The Welsh Extremist and started reading people like Kate Roberts in my stumbling Welsh. So the chance to actually work for a magazine I had greatly admired and which had greatly influenced me was very important for me, yeah.
And I mean, the two of you working together, these were, you're doing 6 times a year. I mean, these were the days of considerably larger budgets than now, I guess. And it was a big magazine, so it was quite an operation, wasn't it? I mean, you were producing a lot of content.
Yes, 6 issues a year with a very, very small team. That's very hard work, actually. You haven't got the first one to bed before you're working on the second one, so it's a continuous, endless roller. But it gives you the advantage of being at least more able to engage with current events, I think, than you can with a quarterly, which is a drawback.
Yes, the quarterly has to sort of hold.
Well, yeah,
perhaps.
Yeah.
How different? I mean, this was so we're now in the late 80s, last half of the 80s. You know, peak Thatcher, minor strike, the after effects of that. How different was the political landscape, and how did Planet fit into that? Do you think?
I think that's more a question for Ned, in that he was the editor from 85 to 90. But could I just say that, interpose here? I think Ned was an editor of genius, really. And a lot of people think, I don't want to embarrass you, but a lot of people think editing is easy, anyone can do it. And poets are particularly prone to this delusion. I'm not sure why. But I spent 5 years as Ned's apprentice, basically, and I learned a huge amount about editing, which I never would have got otherwise. And he'd tell you, you'd learn even annoying things, like you're 1 week away from going to press, and an article comes in, a real plum, and I thought it was all ready, but Ned said, no, we got to pull something. So you pull an article and you put this one in, then you've got to deal with the writer you've dragged out. But he was right, because if you get something like that, you have to go with the moment and change things. It doesn't matter how awkward or time-consuming it is. And I learnt many things like that from Ned, which I would not have got from any other source in Wales, I think.
It sounds really exciting, actually.
Very exciting, yeah.
And you brought, I mean, one of the things when you look back, and the database that Lloyd and Mike have been working on, back there, you can sort of see the prototype version of it, where they've been indexing and cataloguing all of the editions of Planet, so you'll be able to, there'll be a searchable database where you can do it by location of features, you can do it through the author, through the subject matter, through whatever. And one of the things that I was looking at it earlier on and looking at the 80s, and it's still not. Am I doing something really stupid? It's seems to. Oh no. Cheers, yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really good was I was looking at the database in the 80s from when he relaunched, and indeed from the early days in a way. I mean, of course, the title of the magazine itself, Planet, gives this away. But there was a really strong environmental element to it that you, particularly, I know you were there, Ned, with it, and John really was up to it, especially.
John brought that to it, and it's interesting that titles have a life of their own. You know, I chose Planet as a sort of deliberate, not to count another title with Welsh in it, and to make one sort of statement. But the title sort of in time became John's title with his pioneering of green issues, and suddenly people began to think, oh, Planet, of course. So that's interesting. Titles, they have a life of their own.
Yeah, well, they mutate into something. But I mean, it was a perfect fit in a way, and you really did. I mean, this was. So let's not forget, you know, those of you too young to remember, this was not a time when this stuff was taken seriously at all. And you were banging the drum for it.
Well, in the 80s, I decided I knew nothing about science, and I had to re-educate myself. And I did that, but especially in biological sciences, paleontology, paleoanthropology. And reading around in these fields made me realize by the mid-80s that the Earth is facing a crisis. And it's not just a crisis of global warming, that's very important, but it's a multiple interlocking series of crises and mass extinction of species. We're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction. No biologist would disagree. That is just as important as climate change. And I felt that there was an urge to contemplate these things and kind of bring them to notice in the magazine. I don't think maybe that what we wrote, we had quite a bit on environment with scientists, but also environmentalists like Robert Minhinnick. I don't think it necessarily changed anything. It might have changed some people's minds, but I felt that there had to be a witness, in a sense, to what was happening. And I hope during that period, Planet was a kind of witness to what was going on.
So, Emily, just going to you now, just on the you know, hearing about the sort of days of, I mean, it's a different magazine now. How what's it like for you to listen to 6 times a year, the budgets, the commissioning rounds, you know, the sheer intensity of it? What does that sound like to you as the current editor?
Well, when I first started at Planet, I started as an assistant. In 2006, it was still bi-monthly. So again, your life was determined by a slightly different cycle. And yes, there was the intensity of that commissioning cycle, but I think the other difference was that that the economic climate was very different, the funding climate was very different. So actually, when I arrived, our core grant was more than double it is now, and also there weren't sort of additional pressures as you would have currently in terms of the austerity regime that we've had from 2008, additional financial challenges from Brexit, the cost of living crisis, the cost of production crisis, and so forth. So the commissioning side and the editing side is far more intensive, but I think that the pressures now are that there's less and less time for the commissioning and editing, which is now pushed further and further into the evenings and the weekends. And so much more time has necessarily to be taken up with fundraising and marketing. And also just, you know, I think that people often forget in any kind of creative endeavour that these endeavours come out of micro businesses, which all have administration. And as anyone who runs a tiny business knows, the amount of regulation and administration has mushroomed, you know, in the last 20 years, 10 years. And so in terms of, I think the struggle now is to still carve out that creative space keep that spark alive, whether it's later and later into the night. And I think, obviously I don't want to put a dampener on this evening because this evening is a celebration, but I suppose it's worth mentioning because this is the launch of a crowdfunder. We should say why we're having a fundraiser. And I think it's particularly precarious time for Planet, but for a lot of other publications as well. And it's this perfect storm of successive funding cuts, and then combined with the after effects of the pandemic, Brexit, rising costs, and so on, which mean I think that Planet was always run on a bit of a shoestring, and everyone always gave a humongous amount of time, But in terms of my experience of working at Planet, which is 16, 17 years now, it's yes, the challenge is having less and less time for what is supposed to be at the very essence of Planet, which is the content.
Yeah. It's insane, isn't it, really? I mean, you're too diplomatic or polite to say, I don't know, but it's also, against the prevailing political backdrop in which we're having to work these days. Anybody who's trying to, we can see that all of us clearly, So, just to go back to politics, let's just talk a bit before I come to Hella, John, about you were there at the helm when in the run up to the '97 referendum and the very early years of devolution. How did you decide to play that part of Planet's? How was it to edit a magazine in that era?
Well, it was both an exciting time, but also a frustrating one in that Thatcher had gone, but what she left behind was still there. And Thatcher was the true revolutionary. The left-wing movements of the late 60s and 70s, they were deluded. They thought they'd swept everything aside, but they hadn't. And that the Conservatives took time to regroup. But by the mid-80s and under Reagan and under Thatcher, they created a true revolution of a right-wing kind which we're still living with. We're living with the consequences. So the '97 referendum had to be seen within that context, that we were dealing with a right-wing revolution and she had basically smashed the left. The only Labour Party which has come to power in any success is Blair's, and Blair is the son of Thatcher. And no left-wing party in Britain has a chance of coming to power, I think. And so that was the context in which one had to negotiate the second referendum, I think.
Right. I mean, and how did the early years of devolution, once it had come in, was there any shifting in the ground within where you worked? Did you feel that there was a new, sorry to go Tony Blair on you, but was there a new dawn?
You're always hoping for a new dawn, yeah. But you usually got a long night. But yeah, there was a sense, I think, that this time it might just work. And I always remember the day after when we knew we'd won, I was downtown by Siop y Pethe, and a car came past with two Goch streaming from the windows. It was Peter Lord and some other people out celebrating the victory. And then I realised, if Peter Lord's doing that, then we have won.
Hella, you were editor from 2006. You came in. I mean, you'd worked and written for the magazine before, and you'd done quite a bit of work for it. And of course, I mean, you'd come here from Denmark. What did Planet represent to you before you even got involved with it?
I suppose I started university in 1968, which will tell you something. And at the time, the front pages all over Europe were dominated by the beginning of the Troubles. So you knew everything about Ireland. Well, at least you thought you knew everything about Ireland. And so I began to realize, because I was doing a degree in English language and literature, and I began to realize that this was actually a political statement, that I had always thought of it as a fact, that you engage with English language and literature, and that was well defined. And you suddenly realize that it wasn't actually well defined, or rather somebody else had defined the area for you. And so I got interested in the Celtic fringe. And then I met John, and he took Planet. And it so happened that the degree that I was doing had a space for, you had to give a lecture which had nothing to do with language, well, not with the English language, and nothing to do with literature. And so I thought, right, I'll do Cymdeithas yr Iaith. And then I'll have to start by telling people that such a thing as a Welsh language actually exists. Because people really didn't know that. If you say, and it's still like that in Denmark, if you say, talk about the Welsh language, they say, oh, it's a dialect of English then. And you say, no, it's not a dialect of English, it's a Celtic language, and people had not heard of that. And it's still a problem that Britain is seen as England. Even my family, who know I live in Wales, I have to keep, they'll say to me, you who live in England, and then they say, oops, I mean, you who live in Wales. And that was all feeding into my interest back then in the whole situation. Then John and I moved over here, and I started working in a minor capacity for Planet. And then by the time I got to be editor, I thought, although I agree with all these reservations about things, I thought, well, actually, we now have a new situation. People have kind of accepted that we need devolution and that there is such a thing as a nation. And once you have a nation, you have to be very, I mean, not that you didn't have one before, but once you acknowledge that you have a nation, you have to begin to also acknowledge a wide range of opinions. Before then, you can kind of say, well, we're a kind of pressure group. But once you're not a pressure group anymore, it's important to show a wide range of opinions, because a real nation has got everything, from the very right wing to the very left wing. And you have to kind of accommodate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So just, I mean, picking up on the sort of subhead of the magazine, of course, Planet, the Welsh Internationalist. When did that first happen? Welsh Internationalist?
Well, initially, as Daniel Williams said earlier, Planet didn't have this because I was so keen not to have the word Welsh, which at that stage seemed to me to be claiming a niche within the British publishing system as Welsh provincial, as it were. So I wanted to get away from that and sort of with Planet. And it was 7 years later that we decided to put the subtitle. By then I think we had established quite an international profile with European minorities, African and West Indian literature, which were interests of mine, and of course in the case of minorities, the Spanish, Franco had died and the autonomies in Spain were coming up, so it wasn't just my interest, it was the general interest. So these things came in, and I think then there was also, I think Daniel Lim suggested this, that we got sick of sort of people saying, you're nationalists, so we say. And there was a magazine called Scottish Internationalist, right, which may have been an influence too. So that's how it came in. But I think we were internationalist in content before the title went there. It was a kind of public relations change rather than a change in the actual content of the magazine.
Yeah. And it's worked so well. I mean, it's such. Emily was saying to me earlier that you know, try to think of something else to. Was there an alternative? And, well, you tell the story.
Yes. Well,
I became editor in 2012, and the subtitle, the Welsh Internationalist, had been removed for a period prior to that. And then people kept approaching me, saying, "Well, are you going to restore the Welsh Internationalist?" And I, had a good think about it, because and then I was thinking, well, is there an even better synonym than internationalist? And I remember thinking and concluding actually there wasn't, in a sense. And I think that partly because the word internationalist, for a starter, it conveys a sense of solidarity, which you cannot find in any other synonym. And something like, you can't have the Welsh cosmopolitan, that gives completely the wrong impression. Globalism is entirely, is in negative terms from a left-wing perspective. So I think even though to some people, and usually when people criticise the term internationalist as being old-fashioned, they tended to be older than I am, and I think maybe for people slightly older than me, internationalism maybe harks back to the 70s, to the era of Oz Magazine and Tariq Ali and so forth. But for me, I think what it does, which goes back to what Daniel G. Williams was talking about, in a sense that we're still all trapped in a system of nation states. We're not in a post-national era. We don't entirely transcend nationhood, and it's often only through stateless nations achieving nationhood that other struggles can be fully achieved. So we decided to bring back the Welsh Internationalist, and I think what I love about the juxtaposition of Planet and the Welsh Internationalist is the concept of the Welsh internationalism. It shows this is a magazine that can bypass or short circuit, the London-based media in its connections with the rest of the world, in forging new affinities, new solidarities with the rest of the world. But you still have, Planet there, which acknowledges that there are other forms of consciousness that do transcend national boundaries. So I think the collaging together of those three elements, Planet, Welsh Internationalist, I think is something you can't really be bettered.
Yeah.
Which is supposed to be a good.
Well, sometimes, this is the thing. I think, as I said to you, it arrived fully formed. I know that wasn't there at the very beginning, but when something works so well that we're celebrating its 52nd birthday, that tells you something in itself. I think that and the ethos of it has been consistent, and the internationalism of it has been consistent through you all as editors, and seeing them, this through a Welsh perspective. Just got a couple more minutes, Emily. Just tell us a bit about what was it that appealed to you about getting involved with Planet and taking on this thankless job?
No, it's far from thankless, luckily. But I think, on a personal level, I came to Wales about 21 years ago, and I discovered the Welsh language movement and the Welsh language and the various traditions of Welsh leftism at the same time as the lead up to the war in Iraq and the movements against the war in Iraq. So I sort of discovered internationalism via Welsh culture. And so when I sort of stumbled across this little magazine in a bookshop that seemed to encapsulate all that, I was very, very excited. And I think by that point, by then I graduated from university, I was becoming quite cynical about academia and then the mainstream media, and didn't really know what direction to take myself into. And I was just so astonished that something like Planet was almost allowed to exist. We do live in such a cynical, neoliberal, Philistine environment, and so I sent a very bold letter, I think it was in those days, to the editors asking if they would like an intern, and luckily they needed an assistant. So and I think we were talking about sort of continuity and change before, and I think although in some ways it's a slightly daunting task, being a sort of temporary caretaker for a magazine that people love and have loved, well before I was born. I think it's never felt like, never felt such a burden by the weight of tradition, in a sense, because I think the thing with Planet is part of its tradition is to be iconoclastic and is to be irreverent and is also to look very boldly to the future. You know, you're talking about John's editor, very pioneering approach to climate change. It's all, even when it came out more regularly, it's always zoomed out to look at the undercurrents, you know, flowing underneath all the froth of current affairs, you know, the sort of ephemeral punditry that's going on, and to see what new movements, what new energies, what, you know, so on are emerging. And I think that's something I'm happy to be swept along with, really. Yeah.
I mean, just last final question, really, and anyone can pick up on this. But that is one of the things. I mean, you know, a periodical that comes out quarterly, even one that comes out 6 times a year. It's not going to be a news. It's not going to be able to come like hot on the news. You've got to take the long view. And the fact that virtually all subscribers of Planet have shelves full of them. I mean, we keep them. We absolutely keep them in a way that we don't other things. I mean, so there's a sort of a heft to it, you know, because it takes the long view. I mean, you're very aware of that. I mean, Emily writes brilliant editorials, which are, and I know they're the last thing that you write before the thing goes in. And you've all done that actually in your time. You've all written amazing editorials and they capture the essence of the moment without trying to be super red hot newsworthy, because you can't be.
Yeah, and I think I remember, you know, that 10 years ago there was so much sort of doom and gloom around print media, and the idea that print is going the way of the dinosaurs and it's all going online. And I think in these last 10 years we've sort of discovered, a lot of people discovered the qualities of print, which then become accentuated, the idea that you have writing that lasts, you know, that's writing of conscience, writing of, you know, of substance. But I think the good thing about Planet, and this is something I, you know, admired as a Planet reader before I started working with Planet, is it's got the spark and the liveliness of something that's very, very current, and the sense of urgency that comes across in its pages, as well as taking the more considered long view. You know, it's not, I don't think, it's never been a dry sort of tome, you know, in a sense. So, and I think that's reflected in the design as well, you know. And if you look at the exhibit at the back there, some, you know, a lot of fun going through the archives. In some, it does sort of have that quality of the sort of Samizdat sort of DIY ethos, very lively, very colourful, kind of aesthetic, but for, you know, it's been very high quality and looking very, very in depth. And I think, in fact, we've got a new series coming out from the November issue onwards, which is almost trying to consciously draw on those qualities of print, in that, you know, obviously we live in a culture where online debate can be very toxic, can be very unforgiving. And I just wanted to, you know, to create within Planet a series that where two people can have an in-depth argument that's rigorous but respectful, and perhaps a little irreverent as well, you know. And it was sort of prompted by this sort of resurgence in interest amongst the younger generation in The Dragon Has Two Tongues, the television series, and a lot of people were speculating, oh, you know, that this series couldn't happen now, that you'd have two people with such starkly different perspectives, who are not sort of only hammering it out and having a very, you know, stimulating discussion, but doing so with a sense of humour as well. So yeah, so that, you know, so in terms of trying to reflect that potential of print to be a counterpoint to the kind of toxicity that you can get online, this is something we're sort of always trying to further.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's so true. That, you know, that print is proving itself as enduring, and it always will. I mean, just on this very simplest of levels, we read deeper off. You know, that's why people want to. You know, he will not die. You know, I remember sitting in publishers' meetings 15 years ago, and they're all flapping around. The book's going to be dead. No, it's not. Anyway, we must pull it there. So, can I just ask you to show to Emily, to Hella, to John, and to Ned, such appreciation. I mean, what a team. I mean, the fact that there's, you know, this is, I mean, there was Jasmine as well for 2 years, but that, you know, that is the full rate